Okay, good morning again. Rocky's asleep behind me there. There he is, having a good sleep. Yeah, on his pillow. He loves his pillow. He loves him's pillow, him does. Anyway, I was looking on Facebook there on a group that I belong to for abandoned places, a kind of an urban exploration group. And it's funny, I saw something that somebody photographed an old van that was parked on somebody's property. They saw it from the road and they photographed it. I guess they got confronted by the property owner. The property owner came out and accused them of all sorts of evil. There was just a neighbor lived down the road that photographed the van and put it up on the site anyway, and the neighbor didn't like it, made some accusations against him. But anyway, somebody asked there, because then other people started showing pictures of abandoned vehicles in the comments that they had photographed that were, poking out of the woods and stuff like that. And of course, right now with the leaves off the trees, things are visible that weren't visible in the summertime. What is hidden is revealed in the wintertime. You know, different things are hidden in the wintertime though, because of course the snow covers a lot of stuff up, but when the leaves come off the trees, a lot of stuff that you normally don't see in the summertime suddenly becomes visible. But anyway, somebody asked a question. They said, "Who's dumping all these old vehicles in the woods?" And it's either somebody from the cities who isn't used to how things are in the country, or it's somebody maybe who's young and doesn't remember how it used to be. But I can tell you, in my area, around where I grew up, it wasn't unusual at all to see old cars parked on people's properties and just sitting there, you know. Years ago, when you were done with a car, if you had land, you just parked the car and walked away from it, you know. Park it in the field or park it in behind the barn or whatever, or beside the barn, and you just walked away from it. And there were places where they had every car the family had ever owned on the property. A lot of the time that was in the back 40. They'd have their own little wrecking yard, and every piece of machinery and every vehicle and so on that had ever been used on the farm or by the farm family was parked back there. And I knew of several places like that where there were rows of old vehicles, old cars and trucks and tractors and manure spreaders and cultivators and everything else just parked back there. And if the farmer needed a part or a piece of metal or something, he'd go back there to get it. But anyway, it'd be a real treasure trove now. The government forced a lot of those people to clean up that stuff, and it's gone now. But a lot of that stuff would be a real treasure trove nowadays, for people restoring old vehicles, people who restore old cars or old tractors or whatever. But it did bring back some memories. The question he asked did bring back some memories. And there was one road that ran from the village of Westport to the city of Kingston in Ontario here. It was called the Old Perth Road. And I remember going to Kingston on that road. And that was a place where even back then it stood out, because practically every house was surrounded by derelict vehicles. And I mean, there were cars in people's yards that had been sitting there since the 40s and 50s. Cars that you'd see Model T Fords sitting beside the house, and stuff. And you'd see cars right up to say the 60s or whatever, and so on. In the 1980s, you'd see that. Cars from the 20s right up into the 60s just sitting there beside the house. And some places they just had a path through the cars to get to the house, And a lot of them, they had every washing machine and every refrigerator and, every ice box. Virtually everything the family ever owned in the house, when they were finished with it, they just opened the door and threw it outside. And, so you'd see an old car parked there, an old 1940s or 50s car, and there'd be a refrigerator laying across the hood or something, That wasn't unusual. or there'd be a washing machine on the roof and stuff. That wasn't uncommon back then up through there. In fact, there was a 1969 Dodge Polara sedan that had broken down, and it looked like they'd managed to get it almost completely off the road, but the rear corner of the car was still encroaching into the roadway. The rear driver's side bumper basically was still encroaching into the roadway, and if you were driving along there, you'd have to stop and wait for oncoming traffic to go through and then go around it. In the wintertime, the snowplow used to just plow around the car. And that car sat there from around 1980 to 1987. Nobody touched it. It just sat there, and then eventually somebody hauled it away. But and that's the truth. From approximately 1980 to 1987, that old Dodge Polara sat there. I remember it was a big black Dodge Polara, and it sat there. And we used to. I remember having to stop and wait for traffic coming the other way when I drove up through there. Or I say if I was coming home from Kingston or whatever, I'd have to stop and wait, and then when the oncoming traffic was through, I could just go around the old Dodge that was sitting there. We had, on the road I grew up on, which was a road called the Franktown Road, which ran from the town of Perth to the village of Franktown, which is on Highway 15 North. Eventually Highway 15 North goes into the town of Carleton Place. But if you're going up to Ottawa or anything, you go up through there. But anyway, there was a car. I remember it was a white Chev 4-door sedan, and it sat in the yard at a house for years and years. It was removed sometime in the 1980s. But it was an old white Chev 4-door sedan. It might have been an early 60s Malibu. I'm not just sure now, but it was like a mid-sized 4-door Chev sedan anyway. And it sat there for years and years, never moved. And the backstory behind that one is actually quite sad. What had happened was the son of the family had borrowed his dad's car to go somewhere. I guess he didn't really trust his car, so he borrowed his father's car. And he got killed in a car accident in it. And so he never was able to come back and take his car. And so the family left his car parked where he had left it as a memorial to him. Basically, the old Chev was sitting there waiting for its deceased owner to come back and claim it, And it was just a memorial to their son, who was killed in their car. And so, yeah, so there you go. Anyway, that's just some of it. It wasn't unusual in the old days, though, to see old cars parked on people's properties. My friend Cliff that had the scrapyard, there was one time he started hauling in all this old stuff. All old kid stuff from the 1920s and 30s even. I remember he hauled in a Star. You never hear of a Star anymore, but he actually did, a car called a Star. He hauled in an old Durant. I remember that too, a Durant. He hauled in an old British, what was it now? I can't think now of what it was. It was like a 1949. It was a 1949 model car. I wish I could think of the name of it now, but I can't offhand. But it was a 4-door sedan, and it was a British car. He hauled that in. I remember the valve covers were missing off it, but otherwise it was all together. And back in those days, British cars were known for bad valves. They used to have to do valve jobs on them. Every 2 or 3 years, you'd have to do a valve job. So I remember thinking probably what happened is, because the license plate on it was a 1959 plate, I remember thinking, I'll bet you somebody started to do a valve job and just never bothered to finish it. And the car sat, Anyway, the valve covers were missing, but otherwise it was all there. And I asked him where all the cars were coming from. And he told me, he said an elderly woman had called him up in a panic. This is really sad, actually, what happened. She had a government man come to her door, and he said, "You're running an illegal wrecking yard here on your property." Well, it was an old farm property, and she had married her husband back in the 40s, and it was her husband's family's farm, and her husband and her husband's father, her father-in-law, they had a wrecking yard on the property. Whenever they were finished with a vehicle, they'd just park it in the back 40 and leave it. Well, I guess the government, video size limit reached. I'll try to finish the story quick. The government had a satellite photograph of the property. And this government guy came to her door and said, "You got to get that stuff all out of there, or we're going to start fining you thousands of dollars a day for it being there." And the poor woman was in a panic. And she told the guy, she said, "I have nothing, it was my husband and my husband's father, and they're long gone. I'm just here living out the rest of my life in the